as I've said many times before, TERFs are absolutely anti-science, anti-academia, anti-critical thinking, and also just bad at reading. And we have a fantastic new example of this. There was this fantastic study published in the Hormones and Behavior Journal, and a bunch of TERFs are just getting so mad at it over on X.com. And I want to highlight a couple of the ways that they're just like reading over either not understanding or not honestly engaging with what the study is saying, or maybe even they're just too dumb to read. First off, you see a selected quote from the article, and what's so misleading about this quote is this first section where they're talking about the call to arms, not a how-to or a roadmap. We are well positioned to implement this deconstructionist approach in lieu of binary sex frameworks to move away from this hypersimplistic sex model, kind of talking about transitioning medicine, healthcare, to be a little bit more nuanced and account the intricacies of sex, to be more understanding and inclusive of intersex people, intersex bodies, transsexual people, transsexual bodies, and how we conduct medicine and research. And then we see this jump to not the conclusion, because that first part which she said was part of the conclusion, and then she does one of them ... dots backwards to the second page of the article where she says sex is a constructed category, not a biological variable. And this is so deceptive because what this statement is talking about is something completely different. And so I wanted to give like a quick little overview about what this article is actually saying, and then kind of get into some of the misleading stuff that the TERFs are talking about. There's two main points that this article has. The first point is that when we do research and medicine with respect to biological sex, we tend to have this very simplistic kind of binary framework with respect to how we report things. Like you go to a doctor's office, you fill out like a male or female checkbox, and that's that. But in reality, when we use the term sex, we're often referring to lots of different characteristics. We might be referring to hormones, we might be referring to chromosomes, we might be referring to specific genes, we might be referring to the presence of certain body parts. And this simple kind of like binary checkbox is going to misrepresent the biological reality of a lot of intersex and transsexual people. Even like under the broadest definitions of intersex, all of these people would be to some degree miscategorized by a simple binary classification. Adopting broader definitions of intersex, you'll find that about 2% of the population is intersex, in addition to maybe like 0.5% to 1% of the population being transsexual. And this will give you like a significant portion of the population, 2 to 3%, where this kind of binary MF box doesn't really accurately represent our biological realities and medical needs. Somebody that has, say, female hormones, yet has testicles, is going to have a very unique medical profile, biological functions, medical needs, that is really important to keep in mind in research. And so one of the ways that this kind of like simplistic sex model influences research in a way that's harmful, one of the ways is that it causes us to not get specific information or actually extract the underlying mechanisms behind something. So for example, if we're only recording like M or F, and we're doing some kind of like research on something that has to deal with like a sex characteristic, we won't know exactly what sex characteristic is in play here. Like, does a particular disease interact with the presence of a certain organ? Does this particular disease react with certain genetic factors? Does a particular disease react with hormones? Without more specific information, we can't really find out the underlying mechanism. I can give an interesting example here. So, color blindness. It is true that people who are assigned female at birth are less likely to be colorblind than people who are assigned male at birth. And we've known this for quite a while, but it has only been more recently that we discovered why this is and some of the intricacies which will let us better understand this. So the reason why is that color blindness is actually just due to a recessive gene which occurs on the X chromosome. And so if you only have one X chromosome, then that X chromosome having the colorblind gene will cause you to be colorblind. Meanwhile, if you have two X chromosomes, then you could have one colorblind X chromosome, one not colorblind X chromosome, and you won't be colorblind. Therefore, people with XX chromosomes which tends to be female people, tend to be women, are less likely to have colorblindness. Now, you might use this to make up, kind of like a simplistic sex-based definition, say, okay, yeah, female people are less likely to be colorblind than male people. But if we were to understand the actual mechanism behind this, the chromosomes, the genes, then we can understand that, well, in like the intersex cases, it's based off of the chromosomes, not say like other sex characteristics. So for example, if you're an intersex person with Swyer syndrome, that means that you would have female external sex characteristics, yet you would have XY chromosomes, and you would be more likely to be colorblind. Or if you were someone that had de la Chapelle syndrome, that's somebody who is physically externally male, but has XX chromosomes, you're less likely to be colorblind. The more precise information we have about sex characteristics, rather than just the simple binary classification, lets us figure out the actual mechanism here. And sex-based research should move in a direction where we can actually extract the underlying mechanism, because when we know the underlying mechanism, we know how to better treat trans and intersex patients. Because if we're talking about like colorblindness, we'll go based off of chromosomes. If we're talking about something like heart disease or cancers, these will depend on certain organs. These will depend on hormones. It leads to better research. The other reason why the simple sex binary framework can be harmful in research is that it causes us to often attribute differences to sex when that's not actually the mechanism which creates those differences. So there's a long field of research which analyzes cognitive and behavioral differences between men and women, between people who are male and female, under these kind of classifications. And oftentimes, these differences in behavior, in, say, activity choices, in, say, like cognitive tasks, things like spatial memory, etc., because of a simplistic, cisgender assumption, because of a simplistic binary sex assumption, it's often that these differences get attributed to sex. But when we look at the broader picture of the data, actually trans people tend to perform these tasks more like the gender they identify with rather than the gender they were assigned at birth. More modern research has led us to realize, oh, actually, a lot of these changes seem to be a lot more to do with gendered socialization, to do with gender identity, to do with kind of like this brain structure, which is related to gender identity, rather than, whether or not you have a penis or a vagina. And having this more precise information about sex, about gender identity, would allow us to recognize a lot sooner that we were misattributing things related to, psychology and socialization to biological sex. So adopting a framework which categorizes sex along multiple variables, rather than just a simple on-off switch male or female, allows us to do better research. And that's literally the entire point of this entire paper. When it's talking about the sex as a constructed category, not a biological variable, this is in particularly reference, you read section 1.2 here, about the NIH's sex as a biological variable policy. So for those that are unfamiliar with this, the broad idea was that a lot of medical research was pretty much exclusively conducted on men, and this led to some biases in medical research. So the NIH's idea for remediating this was to require that research employs quote-unquote sex as a biological variable, as in you record sex, male or female, on studies, make efforts to include both men and women participants. And what this paper is talking about is that this idea of sex being a simple biological variable that is internally consistent is not true and will lead to both of those problems that I discussed earlier if this is our main mechanism moving forward. The paper explicitly mentions that the effort to include broader gender and sex diversity within research is a good effort, but this particular implementation of the sex as a biological variable policy was a little short-sighted because it often left out intersex people, it often left out transsexual people, and this led to the problems we discussed earlier, not identifying the correct underlying mechanism or misattributing the underlying mechanism. And so when this TERF jumps from the call to arms to do better research, and then jumping backwards to sex as a constructed category, not a biological variable, she is completely misrepresenting the context of both of those statements in a very dishonest way. And I also see some comments just being absolutely crazy about this. This person actually misquoting the study here, saying sex is not a biologically coherent category. The actual phrase that the study said was, if we read the full sentence, sex is not a biologically coherent concept. Coherent meaning like internally consistent, simple, like easy to differentiate, but is instead a constructed category reliant on several biological criteria that do not always align. Literally, if you keep reading to the end of that exact same sentence, it says that sex is biological. It's just based off of multiple criteria that don't always align. The best example of TERFs just not understanding anything is this person. It says, well, I'm in cancer research. We work on glioblastoma, type of brain tumor. The absolutely most important category in treatment is sex, but well, who cares? And so I decided to actually do a little bit of looking into sex differentiation in these brain tumors, and what you'll find is that, wow, the approach which makes the most sense is exactly what is described in the study, and not like a simple binary on-off switch that the TERF was talking about. Because what this study found is that the differences in how these brain tumors occur and how they're treated has everything to do with, let's see, a protective role of estrogen, the upregulation of androgen receptors, that refers to like testosterone sensitivity, and testosterone having detrimental effects on the brain tumors. Moreover, hormones and the immune system work together in synergy to directly affect the brain tumor microenvironment. Genetic and molecular differences have also recently been identified. Oh, so if we categorize sex as kind of more complicated and nuanced, we can recognize the main factor at play here seems to be hormones. So under like the TERF worldview of sex, you know, a trans woman would be like male and should be treated as male for brain tumors. But actually, it seems that the main mechanism behind why these brain tumors are more likely in men and less likely in women is that estrogen protects against them. So trans women would be more protected against the brain tumors, and the TERF's simplistic view of sex actually got the sex-based differences of a trans woman wrong. Like, this TERF saying, I work in cancer research, brain tumors are sexually dimorphic, literally highlights why the TERF view of sex is wrong, because the sex-based mechanism in play is hormones, which means a transsexual female like me would have a female risk of brain tumors, not a male risk of brain tumors. And so, you know, I don't know if they're just too dumb to honestly engage with the paper, if they can't read it, or if just too dishonest to actually have that conversation. But yeah, TERFs are mad that peer-reviewed journal literature, all of academia, science, studies, etc., all disagree with them. And in their own comment section, they highlight wonderful examples of how they're wrong. Yeah, kind of got to do some good monologuing there.